Educated administrators and legal experts began to replace the older system of feudal officials and nobles running local government. This bureaucratic expansion improved the efficiency and consistency of royal authority across England. The Tudor court itself became a center not only of politics but of culture and patronage. Henry encouraged the arts and learning, paving the way for the English Renaissance under his successors. While Henry VII's personality was often described as cautious and frugal, his reign nonetheless planted seeds for cultural growth and modernization. The social impact of Henry's policies was profound. By limiting noble power and expanding royal justice, he reduced the frequency of private wars and lawlessness, bringing relative peace to the countryside. The enforcement of laws against illegal retaining and private armies diminished the power of unruly lords, helping to stabilize local governance. However, Henry's tightening grip on power was not without controversy. His rigorous tax collection and enforcement of financial penalties sometimes bred resentment among nobles and commoners alike. His rule could be harsh, and his reputation for frugality often translated into suspicion or fear. Yet his policies undeniably laid the foundation for a more stable and powerful English monarchy. The legacy of Henry VII's consolidation of power would resonate throughout the Tudor era and beyond. The monarchy was no longer merely a figurehead supported by fractious nobles. It had become the central authority in England, capable of directing the nation's political, legal, and financial affairs more directly. This transformation helped prepare England for the challenges and opportunities of the 16th century, including religious upheaval, global exploration, and the rise of a powerful nation-state. Henry VII's reign, born from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, was the crucible in which the modern English monarchy and state began to take shape. The Tudor dynasty, founded by Henry's careful and determined hand, would go on to dominate English history for over a century, shaping the cultural, political, and religious landscape in ways that still echo today. But it all began with the deliberate and often unglamorous work of consolidating power, restoring order, and building a government that could withstand the storms of the past and the uncertainties of the future. The death of Richard III at Bosworth and the rise of Henry VII did not just mark the end of the Wars of the Roses, it marked the slow but undeniable twilight of the feudal world. In England, this was not a sudden transformation but a steady and deliberate unraveling of a social order that had dominated for centuries. Feudalism at its core was a system built on land loyalty and military obligation. Lords held vast estates granted by the king and in return owed him service and armed support. Beneath them were layers of lesser nobles, knights, and peasants, all locked into a rigid web of duty and dependence. But by the late 15th century, the old order was decaying. The Wars of the Roses had revealed the fatal flaw of feudalism: the king's dependence on powerful nobles for military might. These barons, often wealthier and better armed than the crown itself, could raise private armies and wage their own feuds, sometimes against each other, sometimes against the king. They had become lords of war, unchecked and hungry for power. The chaos that engulfed England in the 15th century was in part the result of too much noble power and too little centralized authority. Henry VIII understood this deeply. If he was to hold on to his crown and pass it safely to his descendants, he could not allow the great houses to dominate England any longer. The crown had to become stronger than any lord, not through bloodshed but through control. Henry began to dismantle the feudal structure piece by piece. One of the most symbolic changes came in the control of livery and maintenance. These were the badges and liveries worn by a noble's retainers, essentially their private armies. In previous generations, a great lord might be followed by hundreds of armed men bearing his symbol. Henry passed laws to restrict this. No longer could nobles maintain great private Forces doing so became an offense punishable by heavy fines. Power was being pulled back from the countryside and drawn into the hands of the monarch. Henry also shifted the source of power from landholding and birthright to bureaucratic loyalty and administrative skill. He elevated men of humble origins, lawyers, clerks, merchants, into positions of influence. These were not landed barons with ancestral titles, but men who owed everything to the crown. This meritocratic thread, subtle though it was, began to weave a new pattern into English governance. Royal power was no longer propped up by birth but by competence and loyalty. The financial reforms Henry introduced further accelerated the fall of feudal norms. Under feudalism, kings had traditionally relied on taxes levied through their lords or irregular feudal dues. Henry overhauled this system. He developed new methods for collecting customs, fines, and feudal rights directly through the crown's bureaucratic machinery. Income became more predictable and less dependent on the favor or reliability of nobles. He also managed the land carefully. When nobles died without heirs or were found guilty of treason, their lands were confiscated. Instead of renting these to another ambitious lord, Henry often kept them under royal control, expanding the size and wealth of the crown's direct holdings. The crown estates grew, and with them the king's independence from his nobility. The same time, the role of Parliament began to evolve. While still a far cry from modern democracy, Parliament was no longer merely a tool of the barons. Henry used it sparingly, calling sessions primarily to secure legitimacy or enact specific financial or legal measures, but its involvement in taxation and law-making was setting a precedent, one that would mature in the centuries to come. In the countryside, social structures were also shifting. The long wars had devastated many noble lines, and their lands, often left untended or unclaimed, became opportunities for upward mobility. A new class of gentry, wealthier yeomen and merchants, began to acquire land and influence. They were not lords in the old feudal sense, but they had wealth, literacy, and ambition. The English economy was changing too, with feudal dues diminishing and the rise of a money-based economy. Landowners increasingly turned to enclosing land for sheep farming, driven by the booming wool trade. This enclosure movement would have devastating effects on many peasants, driving them off common lands and creating early stirrings of urban migration and a wage-based labor market. It was another crack in the old feudal order. The cities, especially London, began to rise in importance. Trade, finance, and crafts grew, and with them a class of merchants, bankers, and artisans who had little place in feudal hierarchies but growing influence in the real economy. The cultural energy that would soon blossom into the English Renaissance had its roots in these shifting dynamics. Henry VIII also invested in law and order, not through brute force but through systematic control. He expanded the role of justices of the peace and made local governance more accountable to the crown. Common law courts became more accessible, and justice was increasingly delivered not through feudal arbitration but through centralized legal institutions. This gradual centralization, bureaucracy, and control over justice laid the groundwork for the modern state. No longer was England a patchwork of quasi-independent noble territories. It was becoming a unified kingdom under a single strong monarch. The church, too, remained a powerful force, but even here, the seeds of change had been sown. While Henry remained a devout Catholic and used religion to bolster his legitimacy, the political independence he exercised in dealing with Rome hinted at future tensions. His son Henry VIII would ignite a religious revolution, but its preconditions were quietly being set under Henry VII's watchful reign. By the time Henry VII died in 1509, England was a very different place than the one he had inherited. The power of the old noble houses had been broken. The wars that had defined generations were over. Feudalism, once the bedrock of English society, was no longer the dominant force. In its place stood a monarchy, strengthened by bureaucracy, law, and financial stability. Henry's legacy is often overshadowed by the drama and splendor of his son and granddaughter, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But it was Henry VII who built the foundation. He was not a charismatic warrior or a flamboyant ruler, but he was shrewd, disciplined, and deliberate. His quiet revolution, the transformation of England from a feudal kingdom into a centralized state, ensured that the Tudor would reign not just through birthright but through the strength of the system he created. And so the Wars of the Roses did not just end on the battlefield. Their final act played out in policy, in law, in finance, and in society itself. They left scars, certainly, but they also cleared the stage for a new England to rise. The Wars of the Roses may have ended in the 15th century, but their impact lingers, etched into the political DNA, cultural myths, and even the architecture of Britain. To understand modern Britain without grasping the ghostly shadow of this civil war is to miss the foundation beneath the surface. Though the bloodshed ended with the crowning of Henry VII, the psychological toll of the conflict lasted far longer. For 30 years the English people had lived under the threat of sudden rebellion, shifting loyalties, and kings who were crowned in glory one year and buried in disgrace the next. The scars weren't just political, they were personal, generational, and spiritual. Let's start with governance, one of the most important, though often overlooked, legacies of the Wars of the Roses is the rise of centralized monarchy. The chaos of the wars taught a brutal lesson. A weak monarch invites disaster. Henry VI's passivity had opened the gates to civil war. His inability to manage the ambitions of the great nobles, to command the loyalty of his subjects, or to assert control over the government had plunged the country into bloodshed. The Tudor took that lesson to heart. Henry VI and later his son Henry VIII would transform the English monarchy into one of the most powerful in Europe. No longer a figurehead balanced on the shoulders of barons, the king became the state. The Wars of the Roses taught monarchs that survival depended on tight control of the treasury, the army, and the law. But it wasn't just the monarchy that evolved. The nobility, once the power brokers of England, were broken. Entire families were wiped out in the conflict, their lands confiscated, their bloodlines extinguished. Those who remained were weary. The rebellion hardened Tudor regime made sure of that. Nobles no longer acted as independent warlords with private armies. Instead they became courtiers and administrators. Power moved from the battlefield to the boardroom, from the sword to the seal. This shift laid the groundwork for the modern British civil service by prioritizing bureaucratic competence over brute strength. The Tudor created the early structures of a state that functioned through systems, not personal loyalty. Today's model of parliamentary government, independent judiciary, and regulated power has its earliest roots in this period of restructuring. But the legacy isn't just political, it's cultural and psychological too. The Wars of the Roses left behind a deep cultural memory of division, betrayal, and restoration. It's no coincidence that William Shakespeare, writing over a century later, found his greatest drama in these very events. Henry VI, Richard III. These weren't just plays, they were national therapy. Shakespeare took real historical trauma and gave it meaning, form, and perhaps closure. In Richard III, the defeated king is portrayed as a hunchbacked villain, a symbol of tyranny, treachery, and decay. And when he's overthrown by Henry Tudor, the audience breathes a sigh of relief, not because of who Henry is, but because of what he represents: stability, unity, the end of civil war. These plays still echo today because the emotional truths remain: universal fear of chaos, longing for justice, suspicion of those in power. Even modern political language is haunted by this legacy. When British commentators describe politicians as scheming like Yorkist or speak of Lancastrian loyalty, they're drawing from a shared cultural memory that began in this war. Even in sports, the legacy lives on. The famous Rivalry between the football clubs of Manchester United, Lancashire and Leeds United. Yorkshire has long been dubbed the War of the Roses Derby. Their county emblems, red rose and white rose, are visual echoes of an ancient conflict. Most fans probably couldn't recite in full but still feel in spirit. Architecture and geography carry the scars too. Throughout England you'll find castles in ruin, blasted apart not by foreign armies but by civil war. Places like Sandal Castle, Tewkesbury Abbey and Bosworth Field have become pilgrimage sites for history buffs. Roads, towns and churches still carry the names of battles, of families, of betrayals. It's all still there in the bones of the landscape. Even language was shaped by this conflict. During the wars, England began to turn inward. The Norman French that had dominated royal courts for centuries faded rapidly. English, once dismissed as the language of peasants, became the tongue of kings. Edward the Richard III and Henry VII all ruled in English, not just by blood but by language. This shift helped unify the people under a shared national identity, accelerating the decline of medieval divisions between Norman and Saxon noble and commoner. The war also changed the very nature of how history was told. For the first time, propaganda became a political weapon. The Tudor dynasty in particular understood that winning the war was only half the battle. The other half was controlling the narrative. That's why Henry VII sponsored chroniclers who painted the Tudor as saviors and their enemies as monsters. That's why the White Rose of York became in popular culture the symbol of arrogance and tyranny, while the Red Rose of Lancaster became a symbol of rightful rule. Even though both sides had committed atrocities, this manipulation of public memory has echoed through British history, from the Reformation to the Glorious Revolution to the World Wars. British leaders have learned to craft their legitimacy not just through deeds but through stories, and it started here. Then there's the psychological residue, one of the least tangible but most potent legacies of the Wars of the Roses is the British obsession with moderation and stability. To this day, British political culture tends to shy away from extremes. Radicals on either side are viewed with suspicion. Coalition, compromise and continuity are valued. Part of this comes from having once teetered on the edge of total collapse. The Wars of the Roses taught the nation that when power swings too far in one direction or splinters into many, the result is ruin. Even the monarchy itself, now constitutional and ceremonial, bears the imprint of those bloody lessons. Today's British royals rule not with swords or armies but with soft power, ritual, tradition and symbolism. They represent unity because the alternative, as history showed, is civil war. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Wars of the Roses is that they remind us what happens when institutions fail, when kings are weak, when nobles are selfish, when systems don't adapt. Chaos is the inevitable result. It's a warning from the past, whispered through stone battlements and faded tapestries, and that whisper still matters in the 21st century. Britain is a global power, a constitutional democracy, and a hub of finance, culture and diplomacy. But beneath the modern skyline, beneath the parliamentary debates and royal weddings, lies an old story, a story of roses and ruin, of blood and betrayal, of kings and commoners locked in a struggle that nearly destroyed them all. Understanding that story doesn't just teach us about the past, it teaches us why things are the way they are now, why Britain fears disorder, why tradition matters so much, and why the crown still shines even without a sword behind it. The Wars of the Roses ended over 500 years ago, but they live on in books, in buildings, in banners and football chants, in political speeches and Shakespearean soliloquies, because some wars never really end, they just become stories, and stories, as we know, shape the world. When the dust settled on Bosworth Field in 1485, a new king stood triumphant, not a warrior born from noble bloodline, stretching back centuries, not a prince raised in palaces with armies loyal to his name, but a man named Henry Tudor, Lancastrian with a shaky claim and a stronger will to survive the wars of the Roses had chewed through generations of nobles and kings. The English throne had become a revolving door of ambition, betrayal and premature death. To win it was one thing, to hold it that was something else entirely. Henry VII knew this better than anyone. He had lived as an exile, hunted across Europe, his every breath haunted by the memory of fallen kings and the whispers of Yorkist revenge. Now crowned in a blood-soaked field, he understood that survival wouldn't come from brute strength alone. It would come from strategy, cunning, and a mastery of the silent war. The first move, a union of blood. Henry's first and most symbolic act as king was not military, it was matrimonial. On January 18, 1486, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a political masterstroke, a union of Lancaster and York, red rose and white. Through this marriage, Henry wasn't just legitimizing his reign, he was attempting to end the war in the minds of the people. If the heirs of both houses were now husband and wife, then surely the conflict was over. It was a carefully orchestrated image of unity, one he reinforced by adopting the Tudor rose, a new symbol, combining red and white into one. But even as he preached unity, Henry remained paranoid, and rightly so. Enemies in the shadows. Henry's claim to the throne was weak. He was the grandson of Catherine of Alwys, widow of Henry V, and her second husband Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier. His Lancastrian blood came from his mother, Margaret Balford, a descendant of John of Gaunt, but the Balford line had been born out of wedlock, later legitimized with the condition they could never inherit the throne. To put it plainly, he had more enemies than friends. Many Yorkists saw him as a usurper. Some nobles, battered by the wars but still powerful, viewed his crown as ripe for the taking. And then there were the pretenders, figures who emerged from the fog of war, claiming to be lost princes or rightful kings. The first and most dangerous of these was Lambert Simnel, a young boy coached by Yorkist loyalists to impersonate Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence. The Real Edward was locked up in the Tower of London, but truth was never a barrier in the propaganda of war. Simnel was even crowned King Edward VI in Dublin in 1487. Henry acted with a blend of force and mercy. He paraded the real Warwick through the streets to expose the fraud, crushed the rebels at the Battle of Stoke Field, and remarkably pardoned young Simnel, assigning him to work in the royal kitchens. But more threats followed. Perkin Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the infamous princes in the Tower, gained support from foreign powers, including Margaret of Burgundy and even James IV of Scotland. For nearly a decade, Warbeck was a thorn in Henry's side, appearing in Ireland, France, Scotland, and Cornwall, attempting invasions and uprisings. Eventually he was captured and hanged in 1499. Henry's handling of these threats revealed his genius. He was not a brute like some of his predecessors. He fought when necessary, but more often he neutralized enemies through espionage, calculated marriages, and economic pressure. He made it costly to rebel and profitable to be loyal, taming the nobility. Another legacy of the Wars of the Roses was the realization that overpowerful nobles were a danger to the crown. Henry didn't forget this. In fact, he made it his mission to reduce their influence. He passed laws limiting the practice of retaining the private armies that nobles had once used to wage their own mini-wars. While he didn't ban the practice outright, he taxed it heavily and used it as leverage. If a noble retained men without a license, they were fined exorbitantly. This made noble militaries less viable, forcing the barons to rely on the crown for protection. Henry also created the council, learned in the law, a feared legal body that extracted money through funds and recognizances. Nobles were made to pledge vast sums as a guarantee of good behavior. Any sign of disloyalty, and they could be financially ruined through these methods. Henry broke the back of aristocratic independence, replacing feudal might with bureaucratic control, building the Tudor state while Henry VII is often seen as cold or paranoid. He was also a reformer and builder. He laid the foundation for the modern English state not through charisma or grand speeches but through tireless administration. He rebuilt the treasury drained by decades of war. Through careful management, tax reform, and diplomatic treaties, he left behind a full royal coffers, something few medieval monarchs ever achieved. He also improved trade, particularly with the Intercursus Magnus Treaty with Burgundy, 1496, which boosted English cloth exports. Trade, not war, became a cornerstone of his power. Henry expanded the use of justices of the peace, local magistrates, who enforced law and order. These men reported directly to the crown, bypassing local barons. It was a subtle but effective way of centralizing power, and he strengthened diplomatic ties. His eldest son Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, a move that tied England to one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe. When Arthur died, Henry ensured that Catherine remained in England, eventually marrying her to his second son Henry VIII, the man behind the crown. Who was Henry Tudor really? He was not beloved in the way some kings were. He wasn't known for gallant displays or chivalry heroism. His court was relatively austere. He didn't surround himself with flamboyant favorites or lavish entertainments. He was methodical, calculating, and deeply private. But these were the very qualities that saved England, where Edward IV had ruled with charm and excess and Richard III with force and fear. Henry VIII ruled with discipline and foresight. He wasn't trying to glorify his reign. He was trying to survive it and to ensure his children inherited something better than war. His wife Elizabeth of York was a stabilizing force and a symbol of peace. Their marriage produced several children, including Henry VIII, Margaret Tudor, and Mary Tudor, each of whom would go on to shape European history in dramatic ways. Henry's success can be measured not in the battles he won but in the ones he avoided. After 3 decades of civil war, he brought a rare and precious thing to England: peace, the end of an era, the beginning of a dynasty. Henry VII died on April 21, 1509, at the age of 52. By then he had ruled for nearly a quarter of a century, longer than any monarch since Edward III. When his son Henry VIII took the throne, England was wealthier, more stable, and more centralized than it had been in generations. The Wars of the Roses were over, not just in name but in memory, and yet Henry VII's reign marks more than just an end. It marks a transition from the medieval to the modern, from the age of knights and banners to the age of diplomacy and statecraft. He was the last king of medieval England and the architect of its Renaissance. His success wasn't born on a battlefield, it was born in exile, in patience, in strategy. Henry VII taught England that peace is not the absence of conflict but the result of careful, deliberate control. He was in many ways the anti-hero of English monarchy, reserved, ruthless, relentless. But he was also the reason the Tudor rose would bloom for 100 years, and in that rose, red and white, we see not just the end of a war but the beginning of something far more enduring. The last sword had long been sheathed, the banners furled, and the battle cries of York and Lancaster silenced by time. Yet the Wars of the Roses did not simply vanish into the past. Its legacy became woven into the very fabric of English identity, echoing in politics, monarchy, literature, and even our understanding of what power means. It was more than a dynastic feud. It was a crucible burning away the remnants of the medieval world and forging a nation that was more centralized, more strategic, and painfully more aware of how fragile power could be. In this final chapter we explore the enduring consequences of this brutal conflict, how a war of thrones became a lesson for kings, a warning to rebels, and a myth that would live for centuries. A monarchy reborn, the new rules of power. The most immediate legacy of the Wars of the Roses was the transformation of the English monarchy itself. Before the conflict, kings often ruled through personal charisma or raw military strength, but after 3 decades of bloodshed the crown learned a harsh lesson: charm fades and strength can be overthrown. From Henry VII onward, kingship would be redefined not just as a matter of bloodline but as a craft. The Tutor mastered this. Henry VIII built a surveillance state before such a term even existed. He ruled with a mixture of administrative precision and quiet fear, showing that monarchy could no longer rely solely on noble loyalty. It had to be enforced through institutions, law, taxation, bureaucracy, and intelligence networks. His successors, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth, inherited not only his throne, but his lessons. They understood that a monarch needed propaganda control and a careful reading of public mood. They cultivated images of divine authority,